So again, thank you very much indeed, Paul, for having accepted my invitation. I'm really honored to talk to you. And in this rainy day, you made it come here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I have a very brief introductory note about you, and then we'll start with the questions. So Paul Fleming is a professor of comparative literature and German studies at Cornell University. He's L. Stanford and Joe Mills Rice Professor of Humanities and Taylor Family Director of Society for the Humanities. He's also an advisory board member of the Center of Literary and Cultural Studies in Berlin. Well, of course, you can correct me if there is something outdated.
No, that's all correct.
So he has published essays on Adorno, Hölderlin, Benjamin Blumenberg, Elias Canetti, and others, and authored books such as Exemplarity and Mediocrity, The Art of the Average, from Bourgeois Tragedy to Realism, I think 2009. The Pleasures of Abandonment, John Paul and the Life of Humor, 2006. And Anecdote and Interruption.
It's a work in progress.
That's a work in progress. I'm looking forward to that. But also you have translated and co-translated Hans Blumenberg's The St. Matthew Passion. And also Care Crosses the River. It was your own translation, but also recently, the most recent translation, I think, was Peter Szondi.
No, Peter Szondi is long time. That's as a grad student. That's from
that was
2002 or whatever.
Right. Okay. An essay on the tragedy.
Essay on the tragedy.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Paul, my first question. I mean, the reason actually I wrote to you was that your book deeply inspired me. Your book on Jean Paul Richter, and my first question is why you chose a lesser known figure among German thinkers, namely Jean Paul Richter. I mean, philosophers, especially of that period, they are more interested in irony, and Richter is one of the singular figures written on humor. I would be thankful if you.
Glad. First of all, I'm really glad to hear that you might be the one fan of the book. So, so it's a real honor to be in conversation with you. I mean, I chose Jean Paul because at the time I was a doctoral student at Johns Hopkins University. That was the time when Romanticism and romantic irony was everywhere. And I wanted to work on something with, the other being Goethe, Schiller. I wanted to work around 1800. I did not want to work on irony. It was so disseminated. It was so, particularly through Paul de Man, it was kind of everywhere at the time. Jean Paul allowed me to work on an author who introduced something related but very different in the notion of humor, and an author who, as far as a literary stylist, is one of a kind. I mean, absolutely one of a kind, and has an adherence among people from Stefan George through Max Commerel, through many of Celan. The one book of collected poetry that Celan brought with him in exile is Jean Paul. I mean, so when it comes to language, he was really one of a kind. And so it was a mixture of the literary together with the philosophical, and particularly humor. And humor is something related to irony, but more a mode of being than irony. And therefore it's a habitus for thinking about the relationship between the finite and the infinite around 1800.
Right. Wonderful. I mean, as you wrote in the introduction to the book, to the Pleasure of Abandonment that I have here, I quote you, Jean Paul writes against the view that notions of comic belong to the supposedly lower and baser forms of art. Or as he himself puts it, I'm quoting Jean Paul, erst nicht Spiel wird gespielt. It's a very beautiful quote. We play for sake of serious, not play. Where can you find the root of this attitude? I mean, you're talking about humor as an attitude. Where else can we find it? I mean, Jean Paul is a very unique figure in that regard.
But where else can we find it in terms of other authors, or where does he locate it historically?
In terms of authors. I mean...
okay, excellent question. I mean, other authors, in terms of literary authors, a little bit more difficult, but then, Thomas Bernhard would be one for me. Even elements of Simplicismus, Grimmelshausen would have elements of this humor. Theoretically, Kierkegaard is there for sure. But it is, when it comes to his particular style, his particular use of language, and the modulation of tones. I mean, Hölderlin has something of the modulation of tones, but in a very different way than Jean Paul does it. there is still something rather sui generis about him, I would say. But Bernhard would be one who I'd immediately think of as an immediate point where you could dock on to him. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Do you have any authors in mind that you know?
No, actually.
Okay.
I mean, it's not really easy. I mean, I was thinking of Kierkegaard because, like, like at least one book of Kierkegaard, like the Postscript, is with the character Jonas Glamicus. I mean, he's a person talking about humor. Unexpectedly, this melancholic Dane is talking about.
Sure, but I mean, the thing with humor though is that it's not just the lightness of life. I mean, as the quote you said, it is rooted in a seriousness and a melancholy. I mean, it's very explicit. And that's why there's a Nietzschean element there. It is rooted in a melancholic relationship to life. That nonetheless, with Freud would be the other one that rises above without forsaking this melancholy at all. I mean, it is a melancholy that is a refusal of the reality principle in the sake for that small little bit of the pleasure principle.
But Paul, I think that, I mean, not any kind of seriousness can accommodate that kind of humor. Like, I mean, you have even Sartre. I mean, you don't have that kind of, Leichtigkeit. You don't have this. So I think sometimes that there is a specific kind of seriousness that is able and flexible.
I was thinking about Kierkegaard today, and Kierkegaard in the stages of life's way. There's the comic path and there's the tragic path, and Kierkegaard says they're actually the same. The difference, there's one difference. The difference, the comic sees the way out, sees the Ausweg, whereas the tragic doesn't. Now, we can disagree as to whether that's a proper definition of tragic or comic, but I think this notion of the way out. With Freud, you would say, what Jean-Paul describes as humor is actually the melancholic, but rather than being depressive, it works as an antidote to depression. Right. And so it's kind of like the Gegengift, it's like the antipharmacon to the thing that is ailing you. And so not everyone do it because it has to have this little bit of refusal, a little bit of turning away, that little bit of finding. The question that I was asking myself today is it simply an attitude? And I don't know if that's quite enough. That would make it merely subjective. But I don't think it's entirely an objective structure. It's an objective structure that has subjective elements that shoot it through with humor, I would say.
Yeah, but either way, it's not. I mean, it's not really simply a linguistic rhetorical.
No, that's no. It is also that.
It is
also that, but it's not just that. And that was the part that was important for me when I was. I mean, over 20 years ago when I was working on this book. That part was very important to me. That wasn't just a linguistic structure. It wasn't just an understanding of subjectivity as merely linguistic or only linguistic. It is also that, but it's more than that.
Right.
There's an experiential element there as well. That singularity of one's finite existence that one has to deal with.
Excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, just a comment, let's say a quotation again. Was wir aber ewig fordern, ist weniger die Erklärung als die Ergrenzung unserer Wesens. So, according to you, this means humor is a tool to expand life rather than explain. I would be really happy if you elaborate on that. I mean, what does it mean? I mean, there are philosophers who try to explain life, and apparently there are very few philosophers who try to expand life, What is that and what's different?
I mean, what that means for me is that there's the other quote of Jean-Paul that's very similar about, we don't want to live in the city of God, we want to expand the city of God. Which I think is quite brilliant. But what I'm saying is that it's not just a hermeneutic project. It's not only a hermeneutic project as far as understanding life. It wants to expand the possibilities of what one can experience in this one little shot at consciousness that one has. And therefore expand the possibilities, which is to then take the melancholy. Because, I mean, for Jean-Paul, we're kind of damned to finitude. I mean, it's not, that's kind of the starting point. We're damned to finitude, and we need to deal with that. And it's trying to rescue those elements of joy, of conversion of that being damned to finitude into moments that does not deny the melancholy, does not deny the abandonment, but converts it into moments of pleasure, or binds moments of pleasure. And that's the expansiveness that I see in there. So it's not just understanding that, but trying to expand that, turn it into, and that's kind of I don't really know if experiential is the right word, but something along those lines as far as what are the possibilities of one's, shot at finitude.
Whereas, like, the philosophers are hermeneutic, they just try to explain life. I mean, they...
Right, but that's, I mean, you know, I would say Jean-Paul's a philosopher, but he's primarily a literary author.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that relation, I mean, there's another thing that's important to me, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a literary scholar, is that interweaving of the literary and the philosophical, the theoretical, and the important, and this will be for Blumenberg as well. I mean, it's really important that one include literature as a mode of thought.
Right.
And literature as a mode of thought will then also be literature as rethinking the possibilities of experience, what belongs to experience.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah. Again, as you put it, I'm quoting you, laughter for Jean-Paul does not express derision, but a form of empathy or understanding, and understanding for the lack of understanding, Unverstand. Yeah. So, end of quote. Again, I would be really thankful because to explain that, because I mean, like, because the image of philosophers, the philosophers such as Bergson give of laughter is completely bereft of this empathy. Laughter is really this cruel
it's
movement.
Mechanical,
It's a
mechanical
version.
yeah.
But here Jean-Paul is underscoring the empathy as a part and parcel of that laughter.
I mean, I think with Jean-Paul that has to do with the shared fate of being basically damned to finitude. We're all kind of in this, you know, there's that moments of reflection where we kind of, the body is very important to Jean-Paul, you know, and so the fact that, I mean, this is important for all humor. The fact that we, you know, as Plessner would say, you know, the humor is that thing is that we are a body and that we reflect and have a body, and that split between the being a body and the reflecting on the body is kind of crucial for the structure of humor, because there's a constant reinsertion of the physical into the metaphysical, a reinsertion of the physical corporeal into the mental life of the mind. And so you know, for Jean-Paul, this empathy comes from that shared sense of you're struggling with existence the way I'm struggling with existence, and there's a commonality in that that is, you know, that's not one of there's no superiority in that, but there's that sharedness and that shared possibility of, you know, I mean, so he defines humor as the inverted sublime, and he says it's not about implying the infinite to the finite, but the opposite, but applying the finite to the infinite. And therefore it's like it is the ridiculous task of trying to measure infinity with a finite measure, which you will never get there. And so on the one hand it's completely depressing, but on the other hand there's that moment of the levity of the absurdity of the endeavor. And I think that's where we're all in, it sounds terrible as far as we're all in, but there is that shared sense of finitude. People die, you know, people suffer. We're all in that together, and I think that's where the empathy comes in, and the humor being, because for Jean-Paul, humor is the modern condition.
Right.
That's why there's a historical argument that he's making there, and for him, it's a Western thing. Christianity opens that possibility because of it rupturing the infinite from the finite and making the finite absolutely meaningless. But at the same time, all we have is the finite. That's why it sets up, even though Christianity itself is not humorous, it sets up the conditions for a humorous age.
Interesting. Wonderful. I'm referring to another article by another author. Actually, I have to ask him, not you. So referring to Adorno's dictum, Martin Zeil, I mean, you mentioned him in the conclusion to that book. Oh my God, you've written that over a decade ago, like two decades ago. I don't know if you remember that, but anyway, Martin Zeil said there is no, I mean, and referring to Adorno, said there is no correct life in the false one. In his article, Drei Formen des Humors, Martin Zeil talks about three different kinds of humor, like aesthetic humor, theoretical humor, and practical humor. And what they all have in common is a kind of minimality that he suggests. Anyway, as a result of that analysis, Martin Zeil's idea is that instead of sticking to Adorno's dictum, we should say that the result of humor is not that there is no correct life in a false one, but rather the idea of a correct life is false. And it's a very brilliant. Do you think it's a really practical, realistic attitude that we can expect to? Because you know, like.
I kind of know where you go. Let me take a shot, and you can correct me if you're thinking something different.
Go ahead.
So I I haven't looked at that article in over 20 years. So thank you for reminding me of it. I think Martin Seel's kind of correction or reattunement of Adorno, of like, let's just give up on the idea of the correct life. I don't know if we can entirely give up on that. Now, Adorno's, it's the Adorno hyperbole of there's no correct life and a false one. I think what Jean-Paul or, other people from the Frankfurt School would say, there may be no correct life, but that does not preclude one and should never preclude one for fighting for that correct life. And that has to be an impetus of critical theory as critique of existing society and the drive for liberation. Even if liberation is not going to be some state that one achieves. Liberation is, as Angela Davis says, freedom is struggle. That's what freedom is the struggle itself. And so even if there is no correct life, one should be struggling for that. One should be aiming for that. Right. And I think there is a little bit, we're mixing two things here, but I think there's a little bit of, humor has a bit of that, insofar as it is about the process. It's never about a state of being. It is the process. It's a way of being that's always in flux. And so I would think of it that way. But I don't know if that's what...
That was absolutely my question. Should we give up on that?
No, you can't. No. And that's but there's lots of things to say about that. That's also like a privilege of Western society, be like, we don't have to worry about that, or we can't do anything about it. No, the struggle has to be there.
Right. Great. Let's go to Blumenberg.
Okay.
I'm actually, there are not questions because I'm not specialized. I was not able to really, it's really hard, especially the book that you have translated. It's very intense, it's very hard.
Really?
Not the translation, the text itself.
No, but it's about
there are different layers there. Sometimes I think
that,
my God, I have to read 10 books in order to understand this paragraph.
Very interesting.
But anyway, I have like 2 quotes from the book. I would be thankful if you can talk about them. So one of them is that, I'm quoting him, notorious non-swimmers, that philosophers have always been. One climbed to a plank from the shattered ship, let oneself be washed ashore, and then continue teaching at the nearest academy as if nothing had happened. And that was the point. One was a philosopher to the degree that one was immune to such interruptions. Of course, one had to be sure that the inland was inhabited, proof of which were geometrical figures left in the sand and the appropriate moment and not washed away, as if this had been the main thing done on the beaches since the beginning of time. Wonderful translation. Absolutely impressive, but just... I would be happy because he's talking about philosophers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So let me say a little bit about that book.
Sure.
So this is Blumenberg's Die Sorge über den Fluss, Care Crosses the River. I think it's from around 87 that he wrote. I'd have to double check that. I should know that story. It's part of the late Blumenberg. This is the Blumenberg that is starting to write in anecdotes, fables, and small literary forms and examine them and really kind of use them as a mode of non-conceptual thinking. So kind of towards a theory of non-conceptuality. It's part of that project. So these are that's why when you said this is it is a complex work, but it's also a very essayistic literary work, where he tells a lot of stories there. And this is kind of one example of the stories that he's telling. So he's thinking through stories in this later phase. This beautiful little piece is right at the beginning from Sea Emergencies. It's all about shipwrecked and people with been shipwrecked and what that means as a metaphor, so it's an absolute metaphor, shipwreck. And this is the shipwreck of the philosopher. So one thing about the non-swimmer, later in that, he gives the example of an Ernst Junger. And Ernst Junger has this kind of line where he says, back in the day, sailors purposely did not learn to swim, and they had their reasons. So that for the thing is that if you were shipwrecked, you wanted to go down as quickly as possible. You didn't want by learning to swim, you would just struggle for 8, 10, 12 hours until you ultimately drowned anyway. So there's and Blumenberg says, well, that changes with GPS and with other things. That changes. That no longer is the case. Now it's now you want to learn to swim. So there's all about the metaphor of being able to swim or the non-swimmer. The philosopher as the non-swimmer is actually very interesting because that he's taking, what Blumenberg's taking up there is that the idea of philosophy as this universal language. So the philosopher is, first of all, should be the thing that's concerned in the kind of, whether it be in the Paulinian sense of theology or the Platonic sense of the ideas, that's concerned with last things, with kind of the ultimate reality, the ultimate things. So that these are the universals that are shared by all humanity, so that therefore when a philosopher is shipwrecked, when he or she, here it's largely he, runs ashore, they should be able to pick up just where they left off as if nothing happened. So that's kind of what he's playing on there, is that, as long as one sees the writing in the sand and knows that there's people there and that they have geometry as a universal language, the philosopher can get down to work without skipping a beat. What's interesting about that little piece is then he says, this is still the case. Then he's talking about World War II and exile. And he says, this changes, and it relates to today with philosophers, in exile or literary scholars in exile, where he says it becomes much more difficult when the métier is language. And language having that particularity makes that universality harder to achieve. You had that for a while during World War II with all the German Jewish intellectuals who came to the United States, just as one example. But today, it's a lot harder. So it's interesting the way that metaphor of the philosopher as the non-swimmer who can just get down to work after the shipwreck, how that historically changes. And so part of what he's doing is also, he's not just telling the stories, but he's tracing the shift of the absolute metaphor. Even, he'll say that certain absolute metaphors just disappear from being. They just no longer work. They become obsolete. So he's also tracing the idea of the philosopher as that universal, philosophy as the universal language, and whether that still upholds with that. Yeah,
but it's a very brilliant, it's a very beautiful piece. Then next to that, I had another piece, from the middle of the book, I began quoting, there are an infinite number of detours from point of departure or to destination, but only one shortest way. Culture consists in detours, finding and cultivating them, describing and recommending them, revaluing and bestowing them. Culture therefore seems inadequately rational, because strictly speaking, only the shortest route receives reason's seal of approval. Everything right and left along the way is superfluous and can justify its existence only with difficulty. It is, however, the detours that give culture the function of humanizing life. In the strictness of its exclusions, the supposed art of life that takes the shortest routes is barbarism.
I'm so glad you quoted that. I had no idea I'm so glad you quoted that. That's one of my favorite quotes from the book. I think it's a really important idea by Blumenberg. So, because
I would be happy to hear from translator.
Let's go back and forth on this. So the idea there is, that the importance of the detour, and that was the importance of not taking. So rationalism is taking the straightest route. This is what has dominated our society, and for at least the last 150 years, if not longer, 200 years. And you see this reflected in the cultural politics regarding universities. You see this with respect to humanities. You see this with respect to the downplaying of the importance of the humanities. What is striking in that, because Blumenberg is ultimately, he's kind of a right of center. He's not a Marxist by any stretch. He's kind of a Helmut Kohl kind of philosopher, with enormous erudition. But he's saying culture is precisely all the myriads of detours. This is what makes culture. And this is what gives the richness to it. Precisely the difference of all the... But this is actually... It ties to humor. Jean-Paul defines humor as all the infinite number of curved lines. That's what humor is. It's the no longer taking the straight path. Blumenberg is saying that culture is the same thing. That the detour is what defines culture. And that can go in any possible direction. But the desire from getting what's the shortest way to point A to point B... That rationalism, he says, that is what leads to barbarism. That efficiency, the most efficient way of getting there. And so, this is, Blumenberg as a half-Jew who barely survived the war in hiding. It's these small moments where you see him kind of commenting on the cultural politics and really making a case for this. And so this ties to his notion of culture as detour as culture ties to this new embracement of non-conceptual thinking, Theorie und Begrifflichkeit, because that for him is the famous Freud Prize speech that he gave upon winning the Freud Prize, where he does not mention Freud once. That's all, but it's worth looking at. But that's all. It's called Nachdenklichkeit. It's about pensiveness, and pensiveness is precisely the effect that one has when one encounters a small form such as a fable, such as an anecdote. And pensiveness is this thought as meandering. It is thought that's non-hermeneutic. It's not trying to figure it out. It's just trying to follow wherever thought leads you. That he ties to culture. That is the path of cultures, that meandering along the different ways without... Because thinking will be like, how do I figure that out as rationally as possible?
Yeah, sure.
Nachdenklichkeit it's man, and it's precisely what upsets Nachdenklichkeit is coming to like, no, the text means this. This is the one meaning. Then you've ended it. And so this tie between Nachdenklichkeit, meandering, detour, culture, and the importance of the few thought. I mean, there's an infinite multiplicity of detours and only one straightest path. And it really kind of, saying the importance of all the detours.
Right. Fantastic. I mean, talking about non-conceptuality, I mean, Blumenberg published Light as a Metaphor for Truth. Yeah, so
way back when?
Before 1957, exactly.
Something like that.
Which includes his earliest reference to non-conceptuality on Begrifflichkeit. Yeah. So a paradoxical concept for perceptions and experience, as you explained now, which invites expressions in metaphor, in myth, in symbol. So my question is like, is philosophy generally, because you were talking about rationality, but is also philosophy generally opposed to non-conceptuality? I mean, is it the case in philosophy that philosophy really excludes non-conceptuality like it excludes humor?
Okay, it would depend upon. I'm not a philosopher, but it depends upon the philosopher you're talking to. But certainly, the key thing in thinking non-conceptuality, for just stick with Blumenberg, but you could throw in Benjamin, you could throw in a lot, you could throw in Adorno, a lot of different people. So there's a tradition of continental thought that would certainly include non-conceptuality.
Benjamin.
Yeah, but analytic thought certainly would not have. Wittgenstein's Tractatus is nothing but basically a critique of that as not belonging to philosophy. The key thing with non-conceptuality is that, or with the absolute metaphor, the notion of absolute metaphor from the paradigms towards the metaphorology, is that absolute metaphors are not along the path from myth to logos. In other words, they're not kind of unrefined thought that can be resolved into logos, but it's a mode of thinking in its own right that will never be absolved or resolved by logos, that expands the notion of what belongs to thinking. So the crucial idea for Blumenberg is that we need to expand the notion of what belongs to philosophy and thought to include absolute metaphors, which are the only way that we can get at conceiving certain things that can't be subsumed under a concept. I mean, it's and that's why paragraph 59 of Kant's Third Critique is so important for understanding what he means with that. I mean, it really comes out of the aesthetics and not out of the first critique.
Wow, fantastic. You have extended the theory of. I'm going to another article I really enjoyed. I read it 2-3 weeks ago. Immediately I found it fascinating. So you had extended the theory of belatedness of epic, found in people like Lukács. So, quoting, we invent a relationship between the Greek's form and our age of the world. So Greek epic and all it entails is so removed and so foreign to modern age as to not even be an object of nostalgia or sentimentality. Homer, the sole representative of the genre, represents all that is unapproachable, das unnahbar, and unreachable, das unerreichbar, in the epic. A world that found answers before questions have been posed. I would be, again, sorry for repeating, thankful, because there you're actually making this brilliant distinction between epic, the thought of epic, and novel. And whereas in the epic, you have answer to all the questions. In novel, as if you have questions and you have no answers there. So I would be
sure. I wouldn't say it's me. I'm thinking that I'm just saying what Lukács is thinking.
Right.
But I could be wrong.
The way you categorize it.
So what I'm trying to explain there is that, if you look at the first few pages of the theory of the novel of Lukács about the epic world, where the stars are aligned and you can just read the map, there's the perfect alignment between the idea and the reality. That gap, what you call the transcendental homelessness, is just not there yet. And so in the world of epic, there is no theory of the epic because you just live the epic, is what I'm arguing. In other words, every theory of the epic comes after the epic. When the epic is no longer possible is when you start to, when something no longer is possible, you start to theorize it. And so part of the idea there is the epic, and this is tied to Blumenberg's notion of Lebenswelt, of the life world. You know, and so I'm kind of leaning somewhat heavily on Blumenberg to get at this understanding. You know, but for Blumenberg, which is important to the non-conceptuality, we keep going in circles, but the non-conceptuality, the life world is the world of Selbstverständlichkeit, of obviousness. In other words, in the life world, there are no questions. It's a matter of factness. That's just the way it is. And so it's only when you start to ask questions that you fall out of the Selbstverständlichkeit, the obviousness, the matter-of-factness of the life world. But that's when you start to theorize it. But in theorizing it, you're out of it. As soon as you start to ask questions, you're out of it. It's too late. I would say it's the same with the epic. The epic as a genre, as the way Lukács formulates it, it is a world in which there aren't questions. It's just the deeds of the hero. There's a certain matter-of-factness into how those deeds are kind of transpired, how they're carried out. Without that sense of transcendental homelessness, all the questions without answers that define the novel for him. And so that's the way I was seeing that. So it's trying to tie epic and novel, but also the notion of where theory fits into a theory of the novel and theory, what would be a theory of the epic. And the theory of the epic, I want to say, only starts with the theory of the novel. At that point, does the epic start to be
definitely. I mean, I had a very, I have actually a very small digression based on that theory. I mean, like, I try to formulate to what extent, I mean, based on that theory, that explanation, to what extent do you think that, beings in a novel have a privilege? In the sense that, don't you think we can insert the element of place next to that of time in this definition? I mean, they are contemporary without so much attempt. I mean, those who are in novel, they are contemporary.
So you're talking the characters in the novel?
Yeah, characters in the novel, So in comparison to those in epic, they don't really, I mean, this Selbstverständlichkeit, this self-evidence that is in epic is absent in the in the novel, in that sense, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking, actually, I mean, it was hard for me to formulate, that's why I wrote it this way, that there are... I have an impression that the relation between the epic and the novel be compared to the relation of power in its origin and its actuality now. And isn't it then the reason the epic is always belated? It reminds me of people like Butler writing about grievability. The lives that are grievable are the lives of the novel, but the lives of the epic are not even grievable. So that's why it's easier to attribute an epic life to those who are not even grievable, who are not there. So what I mean is that, like, novel does not only represent those who can think, but also those who have the privilege of thinking.
This is super interesting, and I have to think with that.
So sorry, it's a bit.
No, it's really great. I mean,
So there is no grievability in the epic.
I mean, one way let me see if I can get to this via detour. I mean, one way to think about the epic as far as the character, you don't have, the Greek world did not have interiority the way that we have interiority in modernity. So the notion of the character is the kind of the exteriority of the character. In other words, the character of the epic is simply deed. It's what they do. And so there's not, you know, and this would be Blankenburg and other early theories of the novel, differentiating what the novel was from earlier iterations of long prosaic writing such as the epic. And so there was simply the deed as opposed to interiority. And therefore, that kind of the grievability would be in some ways blocked because of the way the character is portrayed. You don't really get into, I mean, I think
there's no psychology there.
There's no psychology to get into. And so I think when you take it to Butler, I think you have to take one twist. Insofar as the non-grievable are those that we see as two-dimensional, who have, they have psychology, they have lives, we just don't see it. And so we kind of epicize them, and we turn them into like an epic background, where they're kind of insignificant things on the background, and therefore they're not grievable. Whereas you can tell the human interest story about the way stories are told in the Western press about the ones that we want people to empathize with, gives them the relationship to the mother and all the kind of interiority, and that's precisely what's denied.
Absolutely.
And so I think I think it's a brilliant idea for showing the strategy as to what we use in determining who's grievable and who's not, by basically the way we assign them as characters.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
In the world.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Yeah.
Right. I mean, but again, when I was thinking, sorry, don't you think that irony? I mean, like we are now in the age of the novel, let's say. Epic. But don't you think that irony itself is a mini epic through the vantage point that we're constantly appealing to? I mean,
but why would you say mini epic? Or explain a bit more.
I mean, like it's not. I mean, it's not only based on exteriority, as you say.
Yeah.
There is also a psychology in irony working.
Yeah.
But again, you have this vantage point. It's not that flat. It's not that there is a there is a point that you can actually see this fullness. At least momentarily, you go up and come down. You have this fluctuation. So I was thinking that is really irony absolutely definable in the realm of novel, or there is an element of epicness in irony? This
I see where you're going with that. I think it would depend upon whose notion of irony we're talking about. We'd have to get into greater detail. But trying to think with that, one way to think about, just go back to Jean-Paul and differentiate humor from irony. Humor is pretty much the immanent plane. And that's where the empathy comes in, because we're all just on this immanent plane where we're measuring the infinite with these finite measures. It's just like absurd. So that's why there is that rising up. You don't really have that. No. It's the shared finitude. It's that shared immanent plane. One notion of irony, with kind of the Schlegelian notion of the infinite reflection, it has that. It is the great swing up, and with the great swing up, there is the possibility. I think there's the possibility of a positive ethics of irony, but I do think there's a way in which irony can be that blick from that gaze from above that does flatten what's below and makes it easily criticizable. Right. But that'd be kind of a more, I'll just say pedestrian notion. I don't want to but a pedestrian notion of irony. I think there's more refined notions of irony that would do it. But I think in the way we normally, kind of in everyday language, use irony, I can see that.
All right. Okay. I have the impression that some writers, I'm talking about Germany, that is again, not completely reflected question. You can skip that if you find it silly. But when I think of Germany and the relation to the past and memory. So I have the impression that some writers as Susan Neyman or Valentina Pisanti, that our relation to the past can be so direct, so literal, and so confined that the first victim of that can be humor and irony, in a sense that what, for example, such authors criticize is that Germans, their relation to the past is so direct and so non-ironic, let's say, so literal, that it doesn't really provide them with a contemporary actual room to deal with the same problems. That's why there is no wonder to have AfD again in Germany. That's why, the same party can be defending the right of the Jews, or they are really they are fighting anti-Semitism. But it's hilarious because AfD cannot be really so it's it's actually not a question. It's like something that I experience in German society day in day out. I would say is that this. I was asked when I was writing my PhD on humor, I was asked, why do you write it in Germany? And my answer was a semi-funny answer was that, it's exactly in the absence of humor that I can write on humor. So like novel and epic. So, but what do you think as a person who visits Germany? Without trying to generalize that, do you think that this relation to the past can really freeze your desire to be ironic, your desire to be humorous? Do you see any relation between memory and commemoration and irony and humor in that regard?
Part of me wants to say pass on this, but I think I don't know. I don't feel comfortable speaking about German society just because I'm not a German, and also just the last few years I haven't spent as much time here. But you could compare it to American society.
Interesting for me, right?
And there is an element of an inability to deal with the past in the United States, without a doubt, when it comes to slavery. I mean, it's just like a complete inability to deal with that. That hasn't precluded a sense of irony or humor. That's why I don't want to make that too close of a connection between the two. I would say there's a certain problem in Germany's relationship. There's a certain greatness and a certain problem in Germany's relationship to the past. That's a very complex thing that I want to get into. But I'll just leave it at that. But usually, when you think of the U.S., there's a huge problem with the U.S. relationship to its own past, and its complete inability to actually work through its past, the way Germany has in many ways.
Absolutely, this is the argument of Susan Neyman.
Exactly.
Exactly.
But
we should learn from Germans.
And she's absolutely right. Something, though it's not. There's also things that Germans have not done right in that. But there's a lot to learn where the U.S. is way behind that. And so I don't want to make too close a connection between the ability to be humor, irony, and how one relates to the past.
All right. So they are not really okay. Yeah. Just one sentence. Mediocrity is very significant when it comes to pedagogy, but it can be dangerous when it comes to politics. Do you agree?
Yeah. Do you agree? Sounds like you're setting me up there. So elaborate a little bit more, man.
So I mean, because I was.
Yeah, but so what are you thinking when you ask that?
Iran. I mean, what I was thinking was that when I started studying here in Germany, I was really surprised. I was really amazed how important learning details and basics in Germany is in comparison to Iran, where we actually, sometimes without learning the basics, we have to do something. We have to go to the advanced level of the thing. So in comparison to Iran, when only sharing ideas, when only clever ideas were celebrated, and mediocrity was actually always criticized as something banal. The pedagogical situation, the academic situation in Iran was a disaster for me because of that, actually. But then when I look at here, it's not actually. I mean, although I see how great the Bildung system in Germany is, how wonderful it is, but it's no guarantee that this mediocrity can function in politics. Can really. That's the reason I asked this question, this sentence. I wrote this sentence.
So I wrote the book on mediocrity. I always make the joke of wanting to have an institute for mediocrity, the 20th century, so my book is looking at kind of the rise of the average and the challenge that it poses to art. Insofar as, on the one hand, it's Hegel's prose of the world. We live in the prose of the world. The age of art is over. It's a thing of the past. And yet art persists. And how does art then negotiate this newfound averageness of the rise of the common man, the rise of democracy? It's the end of the age of the great heroes, all those things, and nonetheless art needs to persist. And how would that relationship between some notion of exemplarity while still maintaining the averageness? So I think and then you can conjugate that through all sorts of things: pedagogy, politics, etc. And so I mean, the last thing, I want that to be seen as a critique of the average man or an elitist manifesto or anything like that. I mean, I think this is really important. I mean, when it comes to education, the goal should be elite for alle. I mean, the whole point is that it should be the best for everybody and not the different tiering of schools. But mediocre. When you say when it comes to politics, mediocrity being dangerous without a doubt, because politics demands with Blumenberg. It demands the embracing of the detours, of all the different possibilities and the cultures that go into building a society. And that can be averaged out or just the one chosen out. It needs to embrace all of that. And therefore, mediocrity is a tend towards, the whatever kind of the majority in whatever the particular nation the majority is at the exclusion of minorities ruling the day. And that is a form of kind of embracing of a mediocrity or an averageness that can be, without a doubt, dangerous. And there's a level of detail and nuance and difference that has to belong to politics that can get blended out.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Paul, why are anecdotes so important in your thought? I mean, recently you're just translating, writing about.
Yeah. So I mean, anecdotes that arose from translating the Blumenberg. I mean, so my interest arose from translating Care Crosses the River, and that's what kind of opened up. That's why when you said, "Oh, this is a difficult book," I looked at that. I was asked. I was asked, there's 2 books by Luhmann you can translate, or this book by Blumenberg. And I said, nothing against Luhmann, but I was like, I'm not doing the Luhmann, there's no way. And I looked at Blumenberg, I said, this is fascinating. I knew a couple things of Blumenberg. I knew the bigger books, the earlier books, but I did not know the late style. And I was as a literary scholar, I was blown away by it. Because the idea of thinking in stories, thinking through stories, is fascinating. And so opening up that realm of non-conceptual thought and taking it seriously, there are very few philosophers who take storytelling that seriously as Blumenberg does, and as a mode of philosophizing, at least a mode of nachdenklich, kind of pensiveness. And so when you start to then look at, the importance of it for Benjamin, the importance of it, Freud, I mean, early Freud, all the kind of, the dream book, the joke book, and the Power Praxis book, these are all stories.
Right.
It's thinking through stories. And that, for Freud, that is our everyday experience. That is the material. And that is a revolution in thought. Ernst Bloch is another one, And then you start to see it, you see it in Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, where you talk, the story about, look, there's a black boy on the train. Claudia Rankine, An American Citizen, these are like anecdotes that bring together really powerful, about racism, like really powerful ways of expressing it that I don't think analytic thought in describing it does. Because you have, with the anecdote, you have the gut punch. Because it's a very strict, or small forms in general. It can be fables, it can be anecdotes, it can be myths, it can be whatever. But it's always the kind of the expectation and then the reversal. And it's that reversal where you're like caught off guard. And that's the movement towards thought. And that kind of being brought to the moment of kicking in thinking via the literary that then kind of sticks with you in a certain way. And again, you keep going back to it. Like the great story, you keep going back. What exactly was going on there? And you look at, over the course, you're like, I understood that differently back then. That, I think, is what's really, it's the anecdote or the fable, they're everyday oral forms that they're literary, but they're also paraliterary because they're not based upon a really strict, they can be told and retold, and they're told and retold differently every time. And so they have this life and liveliness that belongs to the everyday life on the streets.
Very interestingly, when you're talking about Benjamin, and you call it like Erfahrung, and you say that not Erlebnis, So you say it's neither information nor abstraction. So it's neither pure information nor pure abstraction. There is something else. There is experience.
Exactly. And it's that deeper experience that is kind of captured in the good anecdote, the good fable, the good the vignette, whatever you want to describe it as.
But don't you think that the absence of anecdotal thinking, or let's say absence, it's a piece of exaggeration. At least partly is at least partly due to the fear of losing difference and individuality in the thinking. In order to differentiate, I cannot really relate my story to another person's story. You're talking about Frantz Fanon, you're talking about one black person in that situation. Don't you think that there are some contradistinctions between the thought of difference and the thought of anecdote?
That's a good question. For me, the greater danger of
or allegory even.
Is the notion of anecdotal evidence. So for me, the greater danger is that the particular stands in for the universal. So you use I experienced once, and so in other words, there's a lot of anecdotal thought that people participate in by saying, well, I experienced once, and that then explains the entire world of X, Y, or Z. So I see it, that would be the effacement.
Like a lot of jokes can be racist.
Freud's very explicit about that. That's why, there's nothing, I'll say, there's nothing libertary in a form or a genre itself. I think we want to be like jokes or whatever, to have these potentials by the fact. Freud will say, very explicitly, there's the possibility of the rebellion against power, but for the most part, homophobic, sexist, racist, right, anti-Semitic. You go down the entire line. That's what most jokes are, and it's the community building at the exclusion of the others. And so that is certainly a danger of anecdotal thought. There's no doubt about it. That's why I would not say anecdotal thinking should be the only mode of thinking. It's one mode of thinking amongst others that allows you to think in different ways that analytic conceptual thought just precludes. Right. And so it belongs to the arsenal, and it does not replace the other tools.
Right. Interesting. I think that's my last question now.
Yeah.
Which is, it seems that simplicity and quotidien, in the sense of like in this liberatory sense, is very significant part of your thought and your research. I mean, talking about humor, talking about mediocrity, even talking about anecdotes. I think there is a sense of simplicity that fascinates you. Am I right? I mean, like,
I'm not sure how I should take that.
Talking about Hebel. You say, I'm quoting you, Hebel is a chronicler who counts time by relating everyday situations and common occurrences with such a refined sense of simplicity, this kind of simplicity that and common simplicity that his seemingly whittled down transparent language runs into the opacity of the world. In this simplest of all possible worlds, language and communication totter. The contingent becomes norm, misunderstanding inextricable from understanding. End of quote. Why is then simplicity yet easy yet so difficult to imitate?
Yeah, so now I get what you're going with that. I've never thought about whether there's like a thread like that through, the bit of work I've done. But you're probably right that throughout many of the essays, the books, things that interest me, there is something about the quotidian, there is something about the everyday, there is something about the experiential that kind of keeps popping up. And I think, with the Hebel, with what's so great there is, Hebel is one of those authors, I think he said, you don't know how much work it took me to write these simple sentences. So it's not, the simple is never simply simple. And so there's a refined sense of simplicity that I think, there is something to me that speaks to the, as a working class person, that speaks to the everyday-ness of everybody's lives. That's important, that should not be lost from thinking, from being, from acting. That these are the things that we should be, think, and act on that belong to the lives of others and in their so-called simple lives that are all but simple. And to have it for me, the simple is always going to be, the Einfalt is actually going to be the multiple and there's a complexity there, but to actually embrace it in its everydayness. And I see all the, I guess, I don't know if I see all these, but many of the authors I've looked at have an attentiveness. It's an attentiveness to that everyday.
Do you also experience this simplicity in translating?
No, so I can say, Szondi, I translated way back when I was a graduate student. That was much easier than Blumenberg. So Szondi, once you kind of get the Szondi sentence, which is kind of the dialectical sentence, it was not that, it was beautiful prose, as is Blumenberg. But Szondi was Blumenberg I'd say is 10 times harder. Blumenberg is very difficult to translate because Blumenberg is so condensed that you need to add water to make it flow and work in another language, because he's working so much on the possibilities of German to eclipse, occlude, parataxis, all these things that in order for it to make sense in English you need to add a bit. So the translation I think is incredibly important work, because that's particularly for non-German speaking people and countries, that is how you get German thinking and writing out there. But it's very important work that's underappreciated. I feel lucky that I'm in the position that I can do it and have another job and not rely on that for my existence. But I would say it's anything but simple. And there's definitely way better translators than myself. But I think it's really important work. Yeah.
Are you writing something now?
I'm working on multiple. I do want to do the anecdote book. I do want to finally do. So I'm going to do a small form book that will tie together a lot of the different things I've worked on over the last years, and I am working on something on the literature's ability to anticipate things to come. Working out of Lukács and Auerbach and Benjamin, all of them have this sense that literature, when it burrows down into the present moment, and you're absolutely immersed in the present moment, you can start to see the tendencies of society and the possibilities of points of convergence in the future. So Lukács says, in Balzac already wrote in the 1930s the figures that 1830s that will be showing up in history in the 1860s. Right. Same with Auerbach and Figur. It's all about this anticipation of what's to come. And then with Benjamin, it's Geistesgegenwart. Geistesgegenwart is that immersion in the moment that actually allows you to see future things kind of out of a gut sense of it. And so I'm interested in that kind of from Balzac in the 1830s up through science fiction, Octavia Butler, Philip K. Dick, and other writers. So kind of a big span of the different ways of anticipation that occur within literature, kind of a proleptic realism.
Right. So Paul, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Time.
It's been a blast.
And it was really generous answers, like generous books. I'm really pleased to.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me and wonderful questions.
That was